The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, the economic fallout of the coronavirus pandemic for people of color, plus how tax breaks for the rich are standing in the way of a fair recovery, and Bill Press with CNN's Bakari Sellers, author of My Vanishing Country. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. The coronavirus pandemic is taking a toll on every community across the United States, but nowhere more than in communities of color. That's why Danyelle Solomon is calling for a recovery that will reduce the racial wealth gap rather than increase it. And we say hello to Danyelle Solomon, Vice President of Race and Ethnicity Policy at American Progress. She is co-author, along with Connor Maxwell, of a recent report titled The Economic Fallout of the Coronavirus for People of Color. Danyelle Solomon, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Our pleasure to have you with us. Your report notes that previous recoveries, especially those of the 20th century, created bold new policies and programs that actually made racial inequality worse. What can we learn from how we recovered from those events and the impact on communities of color?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think if you look back at the New Deal programs, they are often cited as, creating the middle class. They lifted, they improved, the work week. They banned child labor. They established the federal minimum wage and overtime requirements. And those programs did really great things, and they were universal in nature. But unfortunately, they also embedded discrimination, predominantly against Black workers at the time, and they were explicit and implicit. And I think when we are looking at, how we can improve in this moment, we need to be really intentional to ensure that we aren't further causing harm to Black and brown workers in America.
And your report also notes that going into this pandemic, communities of color were already at a disadvantage, in part because of the jobs they hold in disproportionate numbers. What is the labor profile of these communities that makes them vulnerable now?
Right. So people of color are overrepresented in service sector jobs, and those jobs are our restaurant workers, our childcare workers, our home health aides, grocery store workers. All those jobs that we have now seen are really essential and the backbone of American society. People of color are overrepresented in those jobs. Unfortunately, those jobs are not valued when you're looking at economic outcomes for them. They're low-wage jobs without good quality benefits. When I say good quality benefits, I'm also talking about they're less likely to have health care coverage or less likely to have options to save money for a 401k. And so when you have less access to high earnings or wealth, it's harder for you to respond to an unexpected emergency like COVID-19. You have less resources to go without a paycheck to keep food on the table and, keep a roof over your head. And what we're seeing right now is workers of color having to choose between that paycheck and, the health and safety of themselves and their families. And that is something that no American should have to choose between.
No, absolutely. And then the issue of the racial wealth gap is also important to talk about, and that involves a disparity in liquidity. Why is that relevant to this conversation?
So again, I think why it's relevant is when you don't have liquid assets, cash on hand, you depend on your paycheck. And we know for people of color, living paycheck to paycheck is a real thing. 2/3 of Black and Latinx women don't have enough savings to live above or at the poverty line for 3 months. most Americans cannot afford a $400 unexpected expense. So having access to cash is really important when you are, when you have to stay home, when the public health recommendation is to socially distance. If you don't have money to, again, keep lights on, keep your internet going, keep food on the table, again, you're being put in a position of having to go back into, society to work to get that paycheck, or to not. And so I think it's important for folks to understand income inequality in America as well as wealth inequality in America.
And that $1,200 from the government that, if you got it, it's not going to go very far.
Right. And it was one time. Right.
Right.
So, I think it's important for folks to understand that if they got it, right, because we also know that people of color are more likely to be unbanked, which means they had to wait for a paper check instead of getting it automatically deposited to their bank account. If they got it, that typically is only going to cover your rent, because we know that we're in a housing crisis, and some food on the table. But there's other expenses people have to pay. They have credit card bills, auto loans, they have their mortgage or their rent. There's lots of bills that Americans have to pay. And I think you see that again in the fact that most Americans can't afford that $400 unexpected expense. And COVID-19 is definitely costing the American public, especially communities of color, more than $400.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're months into it and it's not over yet, too. I mean, there's the other issue. Your report makes important recommendations about how to move ahead in a way that addresses racial inequities and doesn't make them worse. We don't have to have the time now to talk about all of the concrete measures you suggest, but one we can talk about is targeted assistance to minority-owned businesses. Why does this need to be a priority?
Yeah, I mean, one thing I would say is I think there are a number of priorities. This is definitely one of them. It's important to note that, small businesses are usually the backbone of a community, right? They are the ones that are serving the community, whether that's food or retail. They also provide jobs in the community. And so ensuring that our small business owners actually have actually receive help from the government is essential. But what we have seen is that minority businesses have not gotten the help from the federal government that they need. So we know, and we also know that half of all women-owned businesses are actually owned by women of color. And so it's really important that the federal government and state governments provide targeted assistance to these small businesses so they can keep their doors open and provide not only jobs, but also resources, food, to the communities in which they serve.
We're speaking with Danyelle Solomon, Vice President of Race and Ethnicity Policy at American Progress, co-author, along with Connor Maxwell, of a recent report titled The Economic Fallout of the Coronavirus for People of Color. And Danyelle, another suggestion you make is to strengthen the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. How will that make a difference?
Yeah, I think it's really important for folks to understand that discrimination is alive and well. I think we're seeing that actually also play out in the street. And we're seeing that it is rampant, not only in employment discrimination, but also housing discrimination. We've seen it in, access to credit. And so it's important that our federal and state agencies that are tasked with going after bad actors and protecting the public against discrimination are fully funded and fully staffed up. So I think it's not only about proactive measures that our federal government and our state and local communities can do to ensure folks have access to jobs and access to capital for their small businesses, but it's also a responsibility for the federal government and state and local government to protect consumers and to protect their citizens against discrimination.
And your recommendations require that politicians take a stand to advance an equitable recovery. What is your sense that the political will is there to do that? And what can our listeners do to promote it?
Yeah, great question. I mean, I think what we are seeing right now across the country with folks marching is really a tipping point and a pressure point for politicians to listen, that people are beyond exhausted and tired by the inequality and systematic racism that we are seeing in American society in 2020. And so my hope is that the political will actually move us beyond incremental steps or Band-Aid approaches to the problems that we face on a day-to-day basis, and instead move us to much more concrete, targeted structural reforms that we need. In regards to COVID-19, I think politicians, there is political will for short-term fixes, which are important. I don't want to disregard the importance of immediate relief to the American public, especially communities of color who are getting hit harder by COVID-19. So the short term of, extending unemployment insurance, putting moratoriums on foreclosures and evictions, providing that access to minority businesses right now to keep their doors open and people on the payroll, that's important. But I think we have to continue to keep the pressure on our politicians and our elected officials to really look at those long-term structural change policy actions that need to be taking place. Politicians need to affirmatively state that closing the racial wealth gap must be a priority. Politicians need to say that it's not about just a $15 minimum wage. It's about a livable wage with comprehensive quality benefits where Americans have quality, affordable healthcare. And it's not just about coverage of healthcare, it's about the quality of healthcare they can receive in their communities, what type of infrastructure all communities have. Politicians need to make concrete steps to ensure there aren't food deserts and environmental toxins in certain communities and not others. That's harder work, but that's the work that we really need them to be focused on so we can actually live up to this ideal of an American society that is, equitable and free.
Get involved, people. Call your local representatives, your state representatives, call your senators, call anybody and everybody, and let's keep the pressure on. Danyelle Solomon, Vice President of Race and Ethnicity Policy at American Progress, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Danyelle, thank you so much for your time with us today. We'd love to have you back and do this again soon.
Anytime. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
This Social Security measure, I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America. Whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Coming up next, how millionaires are lining their pockets in the middle of a pandemic and how to stop it. But first, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
Today's mass protests against systemic racism are driving Donald Trump plumb crazy. Of course, that's a pretty short drive for him. He would be hilarious if his buffoonery was not so dangerous and destructive. For example, he had peaceful protesters gassed, clubbed, and shoved out of the public square across from the White House so he could walk out and pose stone-faced with a Bible as some sort of political stunt. Especially dangerous, though, is the craven willingness of our top military officials to play along with his infantile attempts to appear manly. When Trump strutted out to do his little Bible photo op, guess who was loping along right behind him, like eager to please puppy dogs? Secretary of Defense Mark Esper and General Mark Milley, chairman of America's Joint Military Forces. Yes, our nation's top two war chieftains were adding their symbolic blessing to Trump's pathetic desire to look tough, suppress our constitutional right to dissent, and militarize his claim of autocratic powers. Milley even wore combat fatigues to the media show, apparently to model the authoritarian look we the people can expect in Trump's brave new world. Esper has been even more servile, playing up to Trump's grandiosity by describing our country as a, quote, battle space that, quote, we need to dominate. Of course, that would make you and me the dominated, which is as un-American as they could get, short of trying to crown the Donald as America's king, and don't put that past them. This is Jim Hightower saying, to their credit, dozens of U.S. military leaders immediately assailed Esper and Milley for even implying that the armed forces could be anyone's political pawn to police our own people, and both have since retreated. But their willingness to toy with it shows how vulnerable our democracy is to autocrats, and how vigilant we the people must be.
If you'd like more of Jim Hightower's real populism, check out the Hightower Lowdown. Jim's monthly newsletter gives you the real lowdown on which corporations, by name, are doing what to the middle class, our environment, and our democracy. Each month, the Hightower Lowdown brings you facts you didn't know, along with actions you can take to fight back. It also comes with a sense of humor. Hightower believes we can fight the gods and still have fun. Plus, get this, it's cheap. Only $15 brings you 12 issues a year. For real populism, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Within the most recent coronavirus stimulus package is a tax cut that is making the rich richer at the expense of everyone else. Frank Clemente says it's time to put an end to this millionaires giveaway. And we say hello to Frank Clemente, Executive Director at Americans for Tax Fairness. Frank, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Glad to be here. Thank you, Jim.
Absolutely. Our pleasure to have you with us. Your organization recently released a report titled Tale of Two Crises, Billionaires Gain as Workers Feel Pandemic Pain. Give us an idea of who some of those billionaires are.
Yeah, so we looked at the 630 billionaires who are here in America right now. We compared their wealth growth from March 18th to 2 months later in May. And their wealth grew by 15%, or $434 billion over that 2-month period when the pandemic hit the rest of us. There were people on the list like Jeff Bezos, richest man in the world, founder of Amazon. His wealth jumped an astonishing $35 billion, nearly 1/3 increase in his wealth over that 2-month period. His wife, former wife, actually, who her wealth grew similarly. She got a chunk of his stock in the divorce. And then Mark Zuckerberg, owner of Facebook, founder of Facebook, his wealth grew almost by half, a total of $25 billion increase in his wealth. Bill Gates is also on there, of course. He's the second richest guy in America. His wealth also went up a very healthy 10%.
Just mind-boggling numbers that it's hard to wrap your head around.
It is astonishing. I mean, you can't even count this stuff in some ways. It's just, we did some comparing. Bezos' $35 billion increase is about the amount of money that was in the pandemic aid package that went to social safety net programs. So the numbers are astonishing.
Well, and as you have reported, part of what has allowed this bonanza to happen is what you call the millionaires giveaway, written into the Coronavirus Aid Relief and Economic Security Act, also known, of course, as the CARES Act. Exactly what is this provision and how does it work?
Well, it's a little hard to explain. I'll do my best here. Tax law is really complicated stuff, and they make it complicated so that folks on the outside don't really understand what's going on. The tax break allows wealthy owners of non-corporate businesses. These are things like LLCs, S corporations, partnerships, and sole proprietorships. Allows them to use business losses to reduce their taxes. So, for instance, the losses they can use, they aren't just in 2020 in the pandemic year, but the law also allows them to take their losses in 2019 and 2018 and to carry them all the way back to 2013. And they by carrying back the losses, by taking those losses, it can reduce the taxes that even these people, these business owners paid in previous years, all the way back to 2013. So it's essentially getting a refund on taxes that they've already paid. Not only that, but it allows them to take the losses they have on their personal side, like a collapsing stock portfolio, and apply the losses on that side, on their personal side, to their business side. So they're getting a double dip here. And it's just kind of, just think about that. None of us can take advantage of our what happens on our personal side and use that to reduce our taxes. But that's what this law allows these folks to do.
Just amazing. Who's eligible for this tax break?
Well, first of all, just understand that there's only 43,000 business owners who are getting this tax break. They earn more than $1 million a year, but the average tax cut they're getting this year alone is $1.6 million. And this is an analysis that was prepared by the Joint Committee on Taxation, which is the scorekeeper in Congress. As I said, the business pass-throughs are the big folks who are eligible. You've got real estate companies like those owned by Donald Trump and Jared Kushner and their family members, and hedge fund owners, some of the titans of Wall Street. They are the ones who we think can most take advantage of this tax break because of the way their businesses are structured. Real estate, especially, because real estate companies often say that they're not making money because of the huge tax deductions they can take on the depreciation side. Most folks don't know it, but a lot of lawyers and doctors operate as pass-through businesses too. A pass-through is a company where you're not a corporation, so the company is not paying corporate taxes. It's the owners of the company who are paying the taxes, and they're paying it on their personal income tax side.
Let's talk potential dollar amounts. How does this tax break for the rich compare to, say, what most Americans are receiving under the CARES Act?
Sure. Well, so the cost of the loophole of the CARES Act is $135 billion. And just for comparison, the CARES Act is a $2 trillion spending program, financial aid package. So this was, $135 billion of that. But that was 3 times more than the CARES Act is spending on safety net programs like food and housing. It's more than the CARES Act actually spent on hospitals and public health. They only spent $100 billion on hospitals and public health. And it's nearly as much as the CARES Act provided to state and local governments, which was $150 billion. So just think about it. 433,000 millionaires got that kind of a tax break compared to all the hospitals, all the state and local governments. And important to know here, as I said earlier, their tax break, these individuals, their average tax cut was $1.6 million. The rest of us, you will recall the one-time stimulus check you got, it was about, at most, it was $1,200. So they got $1.6 million on average. The rest of us got $1,200.
Yeah, if you got it.
If you got it, right.
If you got it. There's the other thing.
You got it if you were in the middle class. The cutoff was you weren't going to get anything above $75,000, above $100,000 on the individual side, and above $200,000 if you're a married couple.
Yeah. But when you're talking numbers like that, well, anyway, it's so ridiculous. And if this isn't making you angry, then you're asleep or something, We're speaking with Frank Clemente, executive director at Americans for Tax Fairness. Frank, in your words, quote, efforts have begun to end this high-end ripoff, close quote. Here you're referring to the second stimulus package, the HEROES Act, passed by the House in May. If the HEROES Act, and it's kind of a long shot, I think, actually gets signed by the president, what would it accomplish in terms of tax breaks for the rich?
So the HEROES Act, when we worked hard with Democrats to get included in the HEROES Act, a repeal of this tax break, the millionaires giveaway, we call it. Not a full repeal, but mostly repeal. Not only does it repeal it for the short term, but it actually repeals it for the long term. And that repeal raises $250 billion. Now, that's a lot of money. And it's money that could be used directly for relief and recovery services to help working and middle-class families struggling with the COVID-19 problem and the economic collapse that's resulted from it. which obviously affects, tens of millions of Americans, 40 million unemployed already, 16 million losing their health care so far. So repealing this millionaires giveaway, raising $250 billion, that funds 10% of the $3 trillion cost of the HEROES Act. So it's a sizable chunk of money, a sizable benefit that comes through this repeal. We've got a major campaign running to repeal this thing. The fight now goes to the Senate. It'll be a struggle.
Yeah, absolutely. But you got to start somewhere, and you got to put up the fight. And as you've noted, cities and states are facing their own tax nightmares. Sales taxes and income taxes plummet. So how would a repeal of this millionaire giveaway help them?
Well, so that's the HEROES Act. The big chunk of the HEROES Act, $1 trillion in the HEROES Act, actually a little bit more when you count Medicaid assistance, would go directly to state and local services, healthcare, Medicaid services, school funding, keeping public safety, police, fire, first responders employed. All these folks are going to lose their jobs, and all these services are going to be cut because our state and local budgets are not collecting much in the way of sales tax revenue over the last several months because the economy has been shut down in so many places, and they're not collecting much in income taxes because 40 million people are now unemployed. So states cannot deficit finance. They have to balance their budget every year, except for Vermont. And so in order to balance their budget, they are going to either have to slash services that all of us depend on, or they're going to have to jack taxes way up, which is hard. The best solution would be for the federal government to come in and deficit finance it through the way it's been deficit financing, the CARES Act, and these other spending packages. But that's $1 trillion, $1.5 trillion just for state and local governments. The governors themselves, a bipartisan group of governors, Republicans and Democrats, they say they need at least $500 billion because of the shortfall in revenue collections and the added cost because of the pandemic. And local governments, again, these are Republican mayors, Republican county officials, as well as Democrats, saying that they need at least $250 billion over the next year or two to get through this thing. So that's what the HEROES Act is all about, which right now is sitting, it passed the House, and it's sitting at the desk in the Senate waiting for Mitch McConnell to come around.
Yeah, that's a shame that's waiting for Mitch McConnell. What is your sense of the political future of the HEROES Act?
Well, I'm not optimistic that the entire $3 trillion HEROES Act package gets passed. I don't see Mitch McConnell agreeing to that, although he had agreed and the Senate voted for the $2.2 trillion CARES Act. But again, Republicans are much more interested in funding businesses and corporations, which is what was a bulk of what the CARES Act did, as opposed to funding state and local services and unemployment compensation. And things like that. And they actually don't want to fund another stimulus payment as well, a one-time check to families. But I think that we're not going to see the $3 trillion package. McConnell's feeling some heat. The latest thing is he's talking about possibly it's $1 trillion package. They all know that the centerpiece of it's got to be aid to state and local governments and services. That there's how big that package is going to be is unclear. You'll recall McConnell said, hey, why not let the states go bankrupt rather than give them any financial aid? I think he's walked back from that foolish statement, but it's not clear how committed he is even helping his own state government and local governments in Kentucky. And clearly we've got to, is he going to not give, the unemployment, the $600 a week unemployment benefit runs out at the end of July. Is he not going to renew that, at least partially? And is he not going to give families another stimulus check when the millionaires got $1.6 million on average from the millionaires giveaway? We're trying to make this fight in the Senate to be about which side are senators standing on. Are they on the side of working families and the services that are provided by state and local governments? Are they going to stick to their guns and not repeal this millionaires giveaway, which would raise $250 billion that could go to all this? After all, McConnell complains that we can't afford another stimulus package. Well, here's $250 billion staring you right in the face if you took it away from these 433,000 millionaires.
Right. Well, the other thing too, so many times it's all about selling it to your constituency and maintaining your seat in office. Change the wording around a little bit. This is a reinvestment in the country. This is a reinvestment in getting people back to work, to being able to pay for their bills, to put food on the table, to get health care again. I think that everybody would have a better chance of accepting this if you just kind of reword it. I mean, and that's for the Republicans to figure out, I think.
Well, I don't think that the problem isn't that the public won't support this. The public is actually, the poll just came out by Hart Research last week showing overwhelming support of the public for this agenda of maintaining state and local government services. The problem is the ideology of the Republican Party in the Senate and the House and in the White House, although Trump's a bit more willing to spend some money. But these are folks who are just it's like they'll do it whatever they can, bend over backwards to give tax breaks to corporations or tax cuts for the rich. But when it comes to helping average working families, they're left alone at the altar. And that's the ideology we have. The public, working families in Kentucky, where McConnell's up for re-election, I guarantee you they will be on the side of providing this financial aid and support to as a result of the pandemic, and that they're not in favor of a $1.6 million average tax cut to millionaires.
Yeah, well, you would certainly hope so. Now, the kind of tax policy that benefits the rich is hardly new. And Americans for Tax Fairness is leading the fight for that progressive tax policy that benefits all Americans. During an election year and in terms of the Democratic Party platform, what would that look like?
Well, it was the debate, I thought, was shaping up very nicely in the Democratic primaries around this tax and investment issues. And then it kind of got all interrupted by the pandemic and, how do we kind of meet the crisis that's in front of us? I believe our position has been that we need to raise $10 trillion over 10 years to create a much fairer tax system and to finance the investments that we desperately need, in improving our schools and providing substantial college financial assistance and expanding the Affordable Care Act so that many millions of more Americans could afford health care. I'm not counting Medicare for all here. That's a lot more costly. In providing affordable child care and housing, to get a big down payment for a Green New Deal, and to get $2 trillion for infrastructure. You add all those things up that all the candidates are talking about, and it's about $10 trillion. And we've shown that you can raise $10 trillion from the rich and corporations over 10 years as well by closing loopholes and reforming the system in a progressive way. Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders, they're both rowing in the same direction on both the tax side and the investment side. But there were differences. Biden proposed about $4 trillion in new revenue and $4 trillion in investments. Senator Sanders and Senator Warren, they proposed about $10 trillion, $11 trillion in new taxes and in new investments. Again, not counting Medicare for all, which is a whole nother league. So the candidates weren't that far apart. I mean, 4 trillion versus 10 trillion, say. I'd be really happy if we could split the difference.
I was just going to say, yeah, absolutely.
That's a good down payment. Now, that was before the pandemic. I mean, we have to recognize we are going to face, I believe we will have major economic problems in 2021. If Democrats win across the board, whoever wins, we're going to need, I think, probably another economic recovery package in the new year. Because I think we're going to be suffering. And we don't want to have this recession or Great Depression linger as long as the last one did. And the only way you get out of that is by a whole lot more priming of the pump on the government spending side.
Yeah, well, and the pandemic that's just it. It's a whole different ballgame. This isn't normal politics, and these guys need to all come together and figure this out, because otherwise we're in a lot deeper than we ever could even imagine.
That's right. Yeah. And, honestly, this is going to be on the Republicans. If they don't pony up, if they don't recognize what the needs are, the true needs are in the country, not the needs of the billionaires and the millionaires and the one percenters and the big corporations who do their bidding. It's the folks who they do the bidding for. It's the folks it's regular folks. That's who our economy's got to be built around. We need an economy that works for everybody. The only way you get that is by by spending on things that need the investments we need that haven't been happening, but we all need to happen, and raising the revenue in order to pay for those things.
Absolutely. Frank Clemente, Executive Director at Americans for Tax Fairness, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Frank, we certainly appreciate your time, appreciate your fight, and would look forward to having you back again soon with us.
Thanks a lot, Jim. Take care.
Thank you. You as well. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. What justice means in the wake of George Floyd's murder. Bill Press with author Bakari Sellers.
I want to talk about the book, but we got to talk about what's going on today, because I see them as almost one and the same.
Yes.
I started reading your book the day after George Floyd was killed, and I was stunned by your first chapter to learn that 32 years ago, in 1968, your father, who was unarmed, was one of 28 young black men shot by white police officers on the campus of South Carolina State College in Orangeburg, South Carolina. That was 52 years ago, Bakari. I thought we made a lot of progress since. Guess not, huh?
We made progress, Bill, but we still have so far to go. And the way that I frame it is so people understand. A lot of my friends, a lot of my white friends, they only look at the issue of race through the lens of their lifetime. And in My Vanishing Country and throughout my life, I try to give more historical context than that. My father got started in the movement because in 1955, Emmett Till was brutally killed, lynched, thrown in the bottom of the Mississippi River. You think about Jimmy Lee Jackson and Medgar Evers. You think about Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney. Even before you get to the Orangeburg Massacre, where Henry Smith, Samuel Hammond, and Delano Middleton were killed. And to your point, my father's 75 now, I'm 35, and we have many of the same shared experiences, from Ahmaud Arbery to Breonna Taylor to George Floyd, all the way back to Trayvon and Tamir and Eric Garner and Alton Sterling, even Clemente Pinckney and the other 8 who were shot in the Charleston Church Massacre. And so, we have work to do, and now we're finally at a reckoning. I mean, I was able to speak with Brother Cornel West, who calls it a rebellion. That you have these uprisings in the street, just sick and tired of institutional racism and systemic injustice.
Are you today feeling frustrated or angry or what?
To be Black in this country is to live in a perpetual state of grief. And so I'm in a different stage now. I was looking at the memorial site of George Floyd and I was sad. I was in a state of sadness. I've been angry. I've been really sad. I've been hopeful. I've been faithful. My daughter is turning 15. I have 17-month-old twins. I'm going to remain steadfast regardless of the emotional state I'm in. And I'm going to persevere, Bill, because, people like yourself, people like my father have worked so diligently to make this a more perfect union that there's an entire generation that cannot give up on this American experiment. We just haven't gotten it right, and we need to fix that.
I heard you say the other day on New Day with John Berman, something very powerful, I believed. If I'm quoting you correctly, it's hard to be Black in this country when your life is not valued.
I firmly believe that, and people are taken aback sometimes by the truth. But there is a question of the value of Black lives in this country. And that's why we chant and say Black Lives Matter. There's not a question of the value of police lives. There's not a question of the value of white lives, but there is a question of the value of Black lives. And when I look at the incident in Minneapolis, Minnesota, there's nobody who can tell me that those officers saw George Floyd as being human. They put their knee on his neck for over 8 minutes, and they killed him like a dog in the street. And none of the officers did anything. And the bystanders were yelling for them to get off his neck. He was dying. This man, a grown man, literally called out for his dead mother. Right. And so there's no one who can tell me that they saw him as being human. They only saw him as being less than. And because they saw him as being less than, it goes through this entire sense that I always tell people that in this country, Black folk don't get the benefit of their humanity. And whether or not it's the social conditions and systemic conditions we live in, or whether or not you see it on the streets, that's why I say it's hard, because your life simply doesn't have the same value. And that's what scares me about raising children in this new world.
What do you tell your kids?
I'm working through that now. I'm struggling with that. I tell my kids the truth, but I also tell them how beautiful they are. And I tell them that they can be proud of the skin that they're in. And I tell them, I challenge them to be the best possible them, and to create and understand the seller's name is one that rings loudly in terms of justice and freedom and truth. And we have to make sure that we become a part of something larger than ourselves. But I'm even asking on TV now, what are white parents telling their children? Mm-hmm. Because for me, it's empowering and emboldening my children to be Black in this country. But I hope white parents are having these conversations with their children as well, and also our children watch us. And so it's the way that you live, it's the way that you interact. I said the other night that there are only two choices in this country. You understand this, Bill. You embolden this. I mean, this is who you are. You can either be racist or anti-racist, right? There is those are the only two choices. It's no, I'm not racist, but I'm gonna sit at home. No, you have to be an anti-racist, right? You have to root it out. And are we teaching our children those messages? Are you going to protect my child, my Black child, the same way you will protect your white child, is the question that we ask him.
One thing that I find it very difficult to deal with, if you look at, you mentioned Eric Garner, he was killed. He was selling allegedly fake or illegal cigarettes or folk cigarettes. I mean, George Floyd was allegedly trying to pass a fake $20 bill. Ahmaud Arbery was jogging.
Yes.
I mean, there's such trivial things that happen, and yet they were killed by white police officers. And so you address this in your book a little bit. What is it about dark skin that just drives a lot of white police officers to do really bad things?
First of all those crimes you mentioned, Tamir Rice was playing with the toy gun. Alton Sterling.
Yeah, there you go. Right.
Alton Sterling was selling CDs. Eric Garner, Lucy cigarettes.
Yeah.
Trayvon Martin was walking with Arizona iced tea and Skittles. And Sandra Bland got pulled over for a speeding ticket. Walter Scott owed child support. Right? None of these are death penalty crimes.
No.
None of them are.
Not close.
Not close. And so you're right. I mean, what is it about? And this is what, like, if you're that scary, like, don't be a police officer. Like, every police officer I know that it invokes this defense. Now, I love law enforcement. I have law enforcement in my family. So by no means is this a generalization. But the law enforcement officers that raise this defense often, that I'm scared of this Black man because, like, if you're that scary, don't be a police officer, right? Like, there's nothing for you to inherently fear because of the color of my skin, yet when still we see that time and time again.
Yeah. We just don't understand it, and I don't know. I know you've dealt with this a lot as a legislator, as a civil rights leader. Is it mean more training or better screening of people before they get in the police force, or better education, or?
So, I mean, there are a few things we can do. And now we're having, see, Bill, this is a conversation that we need to have more broadly, because one of the things that drives me crazy is Democrats and Republicans right now, like, get out the street, come back and vote in November. No, like, we've been doing that all the time. Somebody dies, they become a hashtag, then we tear shit up, and then we grieve at the memorial, and then nothing happens.
Right.
Right. And so, like, I want solutions. And so I want people to start talking about having a national database for bad officers, because right now you can get fired from one police department, go 2 towns down, and become the chief. Right. Because we have no database. We have a database for social workers. We have a database for people who work in preschools and nurseries. We have a database for people who work in nursing homes. We need one for police officers. That's first. The second thing is, which is even more powerful, is that George Floyd and Breonna Taylor literally paid for the law enforcement departments that killed them through the Department of Justice. The grants that the Department of Justice uses our taxpayer dollars for funding these departments. I'm not saying defund them. In fact, I don't think that's politically feasible. But what I am saying is, with the Department of Justice and these grants and funds, make sure they have accountability, make sure they have transparency, make sure they have civilian oversight. They don't have any of these things right now. That's number 2. Number 3, we have to limit qualified immunity. When you're suing these departments, they just hide behind their shield. Like, you can't even, it's just immunity. I mean, so you have to limit that. Number 4 even is probably the most important. It's something that Eric Holder did, which I'm really disappointed that the Obama administration didn't necessarily achieve this in their 8 years. But you have to lower the standard by which you can bring federal criminal cases against law enforcement officers. Right now, that standard is so high. I mean, you have to prove, for all intents and purposes, that the man has a swastika tattooed on his chest, which is just hard to do. And so that is my sentiment. And that's my, those are 4 concrete items that I think we can do outside of arrest all the officers in Minneapolis and also arrest all the officers in Louisville.
Meanwhile, what would you say to those people who go from legitimate, if we can call it, maybe it's a loaded word, protest, to actually destruction of property, as we saw in Washington, D.C. last night, setting fire to the basement of St. John's Church? I mean,
first of all, there are a lot of protesters out there with righteous anger. And then there are people who are on the far right and the far left who have co-opted these movements. We have to acknowledge that. I do understand the trauma and anger and pain that is happening in our streets. As you know, what King called it, King called rioting the language of the unheard.
Yep.
And you don't listen to me, so watch me throw this brick through this window. I bet you hear me now, right? Now, I want people to stop flipping over cars. I want them to stop burning. I want them to stop looting. I want them to stop rioting. All right? I want all of that to stop, because it takes away from our movement. But if you're going to ask them to stop, I want you to be able to, in the same sentence, say, I want peace and I also want justice. I want you to be as mad for the life of George Floyd as you are for the Target that was looted, right? I want there to be that same type of veracity. I want there to be that same type of energy, as the young kids say now, keep that same energy, right? I want there to be that same energy for the death of a young Black boy as there is for a Target or anything else.
What is your take on how Donald Trump has handled this particular crisis? And he's been tweeting again all morning as we speak, as well as for the last 4 days. Helpful?
Actually, man, I am really happy and thankful that Donald Trump has been quiet. You know, I prefer him to tweet USA shows. I guess that's what he was doing when he said Law and Order. I was going to tweet back psych. or some of my other NCIS. I don't know what he was tweeting, but I'm all for it. He went out last week because when he opens his mouth, he sounds like Lester Maddox, right? He sounds like George Wallace.
Yeah.
He quoted a 1967 segregationist and then said, "Oops."
Yeah. Miami police chief, right? Yeah.
Who does that? Who does that? And so, first of all, let me just I'll tell you, like, the large political, like, if we're sitting on CNN, you and I, my comment would be that, when 102,000 people have died and you're having race riots in your street and you're not able to come out of the house and say anything, you're ill-equipped to be president of the United States, which is fact check true, right? But also, there's a part of me that says, I don't need him or want him to say anything right now. Many times when your house is on fire, you don't want the arsonist to start giving you any type of, direction. Right. And Bill, on a very personal level, I think right now we need a leader with a level of empathy, a level of compassion, understanding humanity. These are all attributes that Donald Trump doesn't understand. And in that same breath, I can say that I need Joe Biden to leave the basement and put a mask on and come outside.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And be heard, be more seen and more heard on this issue. Yes.
You have to. I mean, you can take the train to Philadelphia or down to DC. I mean, it's easy. We can organize. I mean, we're not putting you on the front lines of the march, but you need to be there so that people can see you as a part of our struggle.
Have you sent that message to him?
I have, and I think that there are a lot of people who echo the same sentiment I do. And I'm going to vote for Joe Biden, and I'm going to do everything I can to get Joe Biden elected. But also during this process, I'm going to push Joe Biden to be that much better. And we have to.
Bill Press talking with CNN commentator and author of My Vanishing Country, Bakari Sellers. If you'd like to hear the entire interview, visit BillPressPods.com. That's all for the America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Danyelle Solomon, Frank Clemente, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For the America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.